I'm here to talk about some general concepts about how to build decentralized technologies, is it working? To address issues around centralized forms of power and control, specifically the idea of totalitarianism, which is something I'm very concerned about. One of the dinner party conversations I've had over the last few years is the idea of what if we elected a despot dictator unwittingly? This was a while back, and then there's an accident, there's an attack somewhere, and next step is martial law, next step is Patriot Act 2.0, and then you just start shutting things down. Signal, WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, you just take them out. And you replace them with things that are, government friendly. And they don't seem to be surveilled, but maybe they are, maybe they're not, you're just never quite sure. So at that point, you'd say, well, how do I possibly communicate to organize anything which is anti-government? And this is a reality for millions of people in the world right now, in countries in the Middle East, in China, in Russia, many places in the world, and it's a reality for you right now with your government in the UK, where I'm from originally, and related to corporations, which will probably be more powerful than the governments if they are not already. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of security, history of surveillance. Security is a very broad term. Surveillance, much narrower. Back in BC times, Julius Caesar used to communicate with his generals using this concept of a very simple rotational cipher. Essentially, you just move everything along, so a shift of 1 would be A equals B and so on. And the trick is you don't know what the salt is. You don't know what the key is going to be each time. So it's tricky to figure it out. The way you figure it out is that you use frequency analysis on the on the letters, and then compare that to the frequency analysis of typical English language. If you've got short messages, it proves very difficult to do that. In the 1940s, the Germans developed a very powerful tool called the Enigma machine. And Alan Turing at GCHQ in Bletchley Park in England developed some techniques to essentially crack Enigma. Now, one of the challenges of cracking Enigma was that if you then acted upon that information, you would essentially be giving the enemy information about the fact that you knew what they were going to do. And so there's this concept in computer science of the Shannon information limit, which is the idea of what is the amount of information where it becomes obvious that you are essentially you completely understand the message that's passed. Alan Turing, unfortunately, died rather tragically, and but his work and the basis of a lot of these things became the foundation of modern computer science and cryptography. So back in 1989, when I got my first email address, yeah, I'm really that old, I was at Cambridge engineering undergraduate, and I was like, well, this is easy, I guess, kind of complicated. The interfaces are all command line, not like the Apple or Android phones that we have today. And in order to make it secure, well, it was secure in the sense that most of it was point-to-point. You ran your own server. My friend Joe over here would run his server. We just communicate point-to-point. No one's really in the middle except for the carrier. So the ISP or the university or the company or whoever can pick up the message and take a look at it and say, that's interesting. I wonder why they're talking about this. So Phil Zimmerman came up with a technique based on public key cryptography called pretty good privacy. And the way that you ensured that you could trust people was this concept of a web of trust. So, if I trust me, and I trust him, and so on, then eventually I could say that I can trust this other guy that I don't know. PGP was actually classified as munitions. So in other words, arms, weapons by the US government. And commercially, the gap between the US and countries such as Germany, where some very successful crypto startups were formed, actually became quite wide up until the point where the US government was like, we better probably close this gap and make this stuff legal to export. So that gives you kind of a concept of, from the very early days through to, time is accelerating all the time, I find. 6 months seems like a decade at the moment. So we're now getting into 2013. So I don't know if this came as a surprise to me. It certainly came as a shock, the extent of the information that was exposed. And whatever your theories around Snowden are, he certainly did something which is very brave and you know, is now paying the price in his exile. The real revelation here was just the extent to which the NSA was willing to go against what we thought were rights. And I think it's interesting to examine when we go take a look at the Bill of Rights, take a look at the Constitution. Do you really have privacy guaranteed there? It's somewhat guaranteed in the European Bill of Rights. The UK has no Bill of Rights, by the way. It's just like, forget it, you know. Case law, you're on your own. So it's kind of an interesting thing is that this thing that we assume that we are allowed to be private in our communications may or may not be guaranteed by the founding fathers, you know, the European Union. It's important to take a look at these things, and certainly in many countries, it's just explicitly, you know, there's no idea that this would be private. There's some interesting cultural references. I'm a huge sci-fi fan, and I'm actually writing a sci-fi novel in my copious spare time. Thank you. Call me later for a copy in a couple of years. So one of my, you know, one of the scariest ones was 1984, which I read as a teenager, and this idea of the telescreen, the two-way screen, which isn't really two-way, because you can see TV, but you can't see the person looking at you, but they can see you, and you never know when they're going to look at you. And there's an interesting physical architectural manifestation of this, which I'll talk about in a second. The Circle by Dave Eggers, one of our local writers, has this very dystopian idea, and this is what I'm talking about when I say that companies may end up more powerful than governments. And in this one, this company quite benignly sets up and says, well, you know, for example, let's put in tracking devices in kids because, you know, kids go missing, it's really sad. Eventually, a whole society can grow up where you have these tracking devices in you, and then everyone's tracked by the company for their own good, so that they can then, you know, give them better information, and they can like messages, and you kind of get the idea where this goes. And then there are cameras, and just the whole thing's very dystopian and scary. There's a rather bad film based on this excellent book. The three-body problem is interesting. It's a Chinese author who's managed to get this through the Chinese filters because it's kind of sci-fi and they probably didn't understand what he was trying to do. But he talks about the idea that this alien race that discovers us and we discover them doesn't have secrets. They broadcast their thoughts all the time across this electromagnetic frequency. And so there's no idea of secrets. And then the idea is really that the human race, even though they're technologically and physically inferior, has an advantage in that in order to have strategy, you need to be able to hide things from people. So it's kind of an interesting thing to think about there. The physical architectural, the Panopticon was a prison built in England in the late 19th century. The idea here is that the prison guard can see any single prisoner when they want to, and there's a light shining into each prisoner. Now, the internet really is today's modern-day Panopticon. This is a Chinese artist. This is a video which I'll be publishing on Medium, which shows the Underground Railway in Chicago, and essentially how in this public space everyone is being surveilled at different times using CCTVs. The UK, my home country, has more closed-circuit cameras than any other country in the world per person. You literally walk down Oxford Street in London and you'll see these cameras everywhere. The internet as we know it is really messed up. The Equifax hacked 143 million. I think it's something like 40% of you right now have your social security numbers exposed. So think about security, think about two-factor authentication. There are Medium posts on this. There's a great blog on Kraken. I was actually hacked. My phone was ported. And it led to the idea that, one of the ideas that we then went with was an inspiration for the Orchid project. There's lots of various different examples here. China's social credit system. This is, again, you know, trying to make citizens good, sincere, honest people. Let's gather as much information we can about each of us and then decide whether we give someone a loan and so on. And I think there are examples of how to do this with a blockchain in a way that essentially hides who you are or hides information about you or exposes, like in the case of my friend Vinnie Lingham's company, Civic, exposes certain things at certain times as you allow them. So there's ways to do this well and there's ways to do this badly. And I believe this is the double-edged sword of blockchain. There really is the ability to build a very decentralized utopian-style society or a very centralized/decentralized dystopian society where you get perfect control. We all know, and if anyone's ever traveled, don't take your laptop, phone, etc. to China. Buy a burner, please. Don't use Wi-Fi. If you're using Wi-Fi today, use VPN. Later you can use Orchid. But it's rampant around the world. Many of the systems available today, VPNs are shut down routinely in China and Russia. Tor doesn't work in China at all. The Great Firewall is a $1 billion project funded by a large software company in Silicon Valley, built by, and has AI inside it, which adapts using deep packet inspection to new changes it sees in the environment. Bahrain is a very interesting case. There's a well-known blogger in Bahrain who actually gave a TED talk on audio only, talking about her struggle as a queer person, queer woman in Bahrain, and how there was a society of people there who had no ability to really communicate with one another. They're all using Tor, VPN, like whatever they can do to communicate in some way. And she goes on Twitter every day with just a little, almost like emoji character for herself to talk and like basically get out there and say things. Meanwhile, journalists are doing the same thing. Some journalists are getting arrested and killed, foreign journalists in different places in the Middle East and other countries. So the struggle is real. Like we may think, hey, I've got nothing to hide, and this is a mindset that we've been sort of brainwashed about. The idea of privacy was very important back in the sort of early .com days, and now it's just been kind of like, yeah, I'll just share everything. No big deal. What have I got to hide, right? Last year, together with my business partners, Steve Bell, Brian Fox, Jay Freeman, and Gustav Simonson, we created a new idea. This is the Orchid protocol, and this is the only part of the talk where I pitch a little bit. My book, yeah, the book, it's a good one. The way this works is as follows. Does this go back? Yeah, it goes back. Okay, so I'll not talk about how it works. The mission of this is we want to open up the entire internet to everybody. So it's anti-surveillance, anti-censorship. Some people compare it to other systems like Tor. We're actually quite different. Tor focuses on a full stack from encryption layer, routing layer, all the way through to browser. We focus instead on just the anonymization, routing, encryption layer. And we encourage people to integrate our technology into them. So for example, a Facebook app, a Twitter, WhatsApp could integrate on top of us and have an enhanced version of their application that would potentially run behind the Great Firewall. And that's the aim of what we're doing right now, is we want to open up the entire internet, the entire world. And we believe, I believe strongly, that open access to information will increase creativity, give people more freedom, create economic wealth if that's desired. I'm not quite sure about the pursuit of happiness. I prefer the pursuit of life, but let's talk about that another time. The concept is this. If you want to access Facebook or BBC News from another country, such as China, you access different nodes in our network. The ones at the beginning are called relay nodes. The one at the end is called an exit node. And the relay nodes and the exit nodes route and encrypt traffic. The exit node grabs that internet resource, whether it's a website, an app, a game, a virtual reality resource, whatever that is, and then brings it back in a layered encryption format until it gets back to the originating requester. We hide your IP address. We hide the Ethereum address, because we use Ethereum to do this. And we don't necessarily hide your social ID. If you want to expose that, go ahead. If you don't, use Brave or some other technology that allows you to do that. Oops, that's the end. I guess I've got 5 more minutes, this is good. So, what can I talk about now? So I'll give you a little background on the team. So, my partner, Steve Bell, spent the last 9 years running Trilogy Ventures in China. So I had some very visceral experience of this. Brian Fox was author of Bash and Emacs, first employee of the Free Software Foundation. Jay Freeman wrote and created Cydia, the jailbreak for the iPhone. And Gustav Simonson was the Ethereum core security specialist. We got some very diverse backgrounds. I did a bunch of stuff. I ran the Pantera Venture Fund and a bunch of peer-to-peer stuff back in the early 2000s. We have a very diverse team with great backgrounds. We just announced the company yesterday. We've been funded by a lot of the great venture capital funds and companies such as Polychain, DFJ, A16, et cetera. And we'll be fully releasing the technology to the world in early next year. And we encourage you at this point to check out what we're doing, perhaps download the technology, download the software, read the white paper if you're so inclined, and really kind of hopefully embrace what we're doing here. We're really trying to open up the internet and potentially change the world. I'm going to wrap it up at this point. Thank you.